But it's always a matter of probabilities, right? You can never know for sure unless you could go back in time. So this is the first problem with evolution. I want to mention just up front. We're going to look at some more detailed evidence in just a minute, but there's a major problem. It's not actually science at all. It's like a form of history. It's like archaeology or something like that. You're looking at records and you're trying to explain what would happen from those artifacts, but you're not reproducing it in a lab. You can't test it in the same way. Does this make sense? Have I lost anyone yet? Only 2 people raised their hand. No, it makes sense? Okay, I want to make sure you guys are tracking me. Here's the second thing about evolution that's interesting. I told you my background is really more in history than science. I want to tell you a little bit of the history of evolution, and which also kind of knocks out some of the pillars about this idea that science is objective and fair and even, fair. Kind of debunks some of that myth of objectivity. Because here's the reality, that scientific theories and cultural trends, they tend to influence each other. So what's happening in society sometimes will influence scientific theories, and then sometimes those scientific theories will influence culture and society as well. They kind of have a symbiotic kind of relationship. Now, Darwin lived in the early 1800s. His first sketch on evolution came out in 1844, very interesting year, and then his Origin of Species, that came out in 1859. But right around the same time, there was a man in France by the name of Auguste Comte. He was born just a few years after the French Revolution, which was 1798 or so. And he was a French philosopher. And this was very early in the Enlightenment period. And he came up with Enlightenment going on a little bit. But he came up with a theory that he called positivism. How many of you ever heard of positivism? This is actually a very influential theory in his day. And he was trying to actually define what science was, because we're just starting to have these scientific breakthroughs in all kinds of different fields, like Isaac Newton and other areas as well. And so he says knowledge advances along in three different levels. Okay, the first level is what he called the theological level, which is where it's purely superstition, supernatural forces. It's just all mythology. There's no real logic. Everything is mythological or religious, okay? So you go back in the ancient world and they got a turtle pulling the sun across, There's not really any scientific theory. It's just a religious system, a mythological system. And he said the next step is where it moves into something he called the metaphysical level, where they start to try and explain it in terms of forces and things, but they're not really quantifying it. They're not really using mathematics. It's not really what we would call hard science, but they're starting to ask questions about the forces that are behind these things. And he called that the second level, which is metaphysical. And then the third level is what he called the positive level. And this is where it becomes mathematical, it becomes verified, it becomes scientific, science equated with positivity. It becomes objective, it becomes established. And once you have it analyzed to this level, it never changes, it's perfect, it's forever solid and right. And so what happened was, I don't know if he influenced society or society, he was just reflecting what was happening in the greater, cultural milieu he was in. But basically this idea became very popular that if it is scientific, then it's objective, it's mathematical, it's logical, it's not going to change, and it's not religious. By definition, science is not religious. So if you propose a theory that calls for a divine creator or that calls for a supernatural flood, then by definition, that is not science. You see what I'm getting at? And he also made a prediction, by the way. He said astronomy has already been positivized. That's the way he put it. And physics has become very mathematical. We have that mostly figured out now. Of course, he was just starting out, but to him, it was like, oh, we got this figured out. Chemistry, he said, is well underway in this process of becoming scientific. He says the next field is going to be, once we understand chemistry, then we're going to understand biology. We're going to come up with a scientific theory for biology. And then once we understand biology, we understand how the mind works. So we're going to have a theory for psychology. And then once we understand how the mind works, then we're going to have a theory for sociology, how society works. And it's very interesting what happened, because right after he posted this, pretty soon, published this, right after he did this, then pretty soon Charles Darwin comes along with a theory for biology that doesn't require a God or a creator. And then not too long after that, which was biology. And then not too long after that, you have a man by the name of Sigmund Freud, came up with a theory for the mind. the id and the ego and the superego, and he said that's connected with, and it's based on evolution, right? Because you have your brain stem is supposed to be the id, and then the back of your brain is the ego, and then the front of your brain is the superego. And so it said, as man evolved, we developed these different components. But this is not testable either, right? Because you can't open up someone's brain and see the id or the ego or it's not, you can't see it. It's just a construct, right? Something that was made up to explain certain things. And this is why you have 100 different theories in psychology today, because none of them are testable or provable or verifiable in the same way that, say, chemistry or physics is. And then after Sigmund Freud, or right around the same time actually, you have another guy by the name of Karl Marx. And he comes up with a theory for sociology. He says the whole history of the human race is all about the struggle between different social classes, and we need to develop a social system where the means of production are shared by all the people, so we can have a fair and just system. And of course, this is what led to communism. When that was put to the test, it turns out it didn't work very well, right? Didn't work very well. But this was a theory. So it's like he was predicting this is the way science is going to go. All these things are going to become positivized one after the other, and then we're going to develop a perfect system, and everyone's going to be happy. Well, it didn't work, but this was the milieu that he was in. So when Charles Darwin presented his theory, it had a very powerful boost to it because it was non-religious from the start. So it had this big advantage. And if you were to argue against it and try and say, well, I believe in creation, or I believe that species were created by God, or that there's evidence for a flood, then your argument, by definition, is going to be discounted as non-scientific because it has a theological component. You see how that works? So you can't even argue against it because by definition it's not science, as long as this belief is in place. By the way, this influence is still very strong in the scientific community. There is a well-known Adventist by the name of Robert Gentry. How many of you have heard of Robert Gentry? A few of you have, not too many. He was a young physicist. He was studying radiometric dating, and he was studying these things called polonium halos. And there's like little radioactive molecules, and you find them all over the world in granite everywhere. And what happens is with the radioactive molecules, they shoot out little, electrons? Or they shoot out something, some kind of radioactive part, and eventually it decays. And when you see this inside of a piece of granite, you can actually see like a little halo where it's shooting out all the different directions from and it has a very short half-life. So it only takes, polonium-238, how long it takes for the half-life? 300 milliseconds. Yeah, it's a very short period of time, right? Very quick. And you find these polonium halos all over the place in the world, in granite everywhere. And so he published this article, and it went through a peer review process. I guess I'm too much social media these days, but he published this in peer-reviewed articles. It was well accepted. No one was able to refute it. He says, look, there's a problem in these polonium halos. We don't understand how they were formed because we believe, our theory is that this granite was formed when the volcano would come up and the magma would come out, and eventually it would cool and harden into granite, right? So this is where it comes from, they would say. It says, now, if there was polonium in that larva while it was coming out of the volcano and it decayed, then there'd be no trace of it because it's liquid, right? So the only way you can have a polonium halo in granite is it has to be basically instantaneously created and in rock, and then it decays after the rock is already formed. And he did all these experiments to try and show that there's no way that polonium halo, that piece of polonium could have somehow got into the rock. There's no pathways or trails. There's no other explanation. And no one was able to refute his argument. But then he made the mistake, or whatever you want to call it. He says, the only explanation is that the rock had to be created instantaneously. That was his argument. And that really is the only explanation, right? Once he did that, he had a very prestigious fellowship with a major science lab for the government. He lost his grant. He got kicked out of the program. He was not able to finish his PhD, even though he had stellar academics. Everyone turned against him. He was no longer able to get his papers published. And his whole career was destroyed, basically, because he dared to postulate a theological explanation. So you see how serious this is, right? It's not a fair and level playing field. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay, and this is particularly true of evolution. So let's talk about evolution now. We got still a lot more to cover. Haven't even got to the first point yet. Darwin's theory. I've actually read the book Origin of Species. I read it while I was in graduate school, cover to cover. It's actually a very interesting read, very pleasant. He tells a lot of interesting anecdotes. He's very humble the way he writes, and just a pleasant sort of thing to read. And at the time when he wrote this, the theory was actually fairly plausible. There wasn't enough knowledge about how things like genetics or any of these things worked to be able to argue for or against it. It was just a theory, and it kind of made sense. If I was an atheist, it would kind of make sense to me. The idea was that within a population of, say a litter of dogs, right, you're going to have variation within those puppies. Some may be bigger, some may be smaller, some may be white, some may be black or brown or yellow or whatever. Some may have big ears, some may have small ears. There's all these variation. And if some of those variations help that species to evolve, then you're going to have more of the big dogs and less of the small dogs or whatever. And eventually, you're going to have the babies and then the grandson and great-great-great-grands all the way down. They're going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually, you might have something that actually becomes something else besides a dog. And we know this, right? Because we know dogs can vary quite a bit. You have all the way down these little teacup chihuahuas, all the way up to these big, gigantic Great Danes. But the fact of the matter is they're all still dogs, all right? So he was speculating that we know that there's an amount of change that's possible within a species, but maybe it can actually jump and become something else. That was his theory. And if you don't really know how how traits are passed down from one generation to the next, well, maybe it's plausible. At the time, Mendel was just beginning to do his research into peas and just beginning to have a bare theory about how genetics work. We're nowhere near DNA or anything like that. That's a long ways down the road. Microscopes are very rudimentary, very fundamental. When you look inside a cell, they could see a cell. They could tell there's a little dark dot in the middle, but that was about all they could see in the cell. Very, very fundamental, rudimentary knowledge about biology. Not compared to today, but at that time, it was plausible. And because it was non-theological, it was widely embraced by the secular community. It was being taught everywhere. And later, when genetics came in and said, hey, this theory doesn't really work, now science has a problem, right? Because they can't replace the theory with something else that is theological, and yet at the same time, the theory no longer works. So what do? They're kind of caught in that catch-22. Like, we can't abandon it, but we know it doesn't work because genetics doesn't work the way Darwin thought it might work. Or if you find the fossil evidence doesn't support evolution, well, you can't abandon evolution even though the fossil record doesn't support it because you have to introduce a theological explanation, and that by definition is not science. You see the problem that they have? And so this is actually what happened. We have a theory that is no longer supported by science, but it cannot be replaced because it would require a supernatural explanation or a theological explanation. So they cling to it. They try and tweak it, and I'll share some of those changes they've made. Darwinism is dead. They have something they call neo-Darwinism now, because Darwinism is absolutely impossible. Everyone knows it. No one denies it. But neo-Darwinism is just as impossible, and we'll get to that in just a minute. And so this is why I think just looking at the history, understanding how the philosophy, how science actually works, looking at the evidence, which we're going to do in just a minute, this is why I can stand here confidently, not as a scientist, but just as a minister of the gospel, and say, I have zero doubt in my mind that evolution is a failed theory. Okay? And I'm going to give you some of that evidence in just a minute. Are you guys ready for that? Yes. Okay, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I believe, beyond the fact that it's not a scientific theory to start with, beyond the fact that it's not objective, it's not fair, it's not verifiable, it's not reproducible, by every definition of science, it fails. That's just preliminary, and it's completely unfair because it automatically excludes any other theory that involves a creator God. That's just leaving those 2 things to the side. I'm going to give you 5 more reasons why I think evolution is simply impossible. And here's the first one. Evolution has absolutely no empirical evidence. Now, empirical evidence means something that you observe and you see happening and you use that as proof for your theory. No one has ever seen one species turn into another species. That's what evolution is all about. All these species came about by a process by which one species changed into something else. There is 0 empirical evidence of evolution. No one's ever seen it. In the Origin of Species, his primary evidence is that you have variation within a species, like big dogs, little dogs, and same thing with cats and cows and whatever else. Or finches in his case. Or you have white moss, and then when you get a bunch of pollution, then all of a sudden you start seeing more gray moss and less white moss. But these are all variation within a species. And there is no documented evidence anywhere in the world of one species that has turned into, and no dog has ever given birth to a cat. It's just not happened. Right? It never has. Right? And this is what the Bible actually says. The Bible says that each species will reproduce after its kind. Now, we don't know the variation within that kind, how much variation is possible within a dog or a cat or whatever, but cats never turn into dogs and dogs never turn into cats. That's the point. Exactly what the Bible suggests. So we find limited variation within clearly defined species. That's what the empirical evidence says. This is what the Bible says, and there's zero proof that one species can change into another. I got a few of these quotes by different atheist evolutionists, and I like to quote them because they kind of say some things that are funny. Here's one as a geneticist at Columbia and Caltech, and he writes, "Within the period of human history, we do not know of a single instance of the transmutation of one species into another one." This must be admitted. He says, I'm an atheist, I believe in evolution, but we have zero proof that it's ever happened. Okay? So this is a problem with evolution. There's absolutely no proof that it has ever happened. Now you may say, well, what about the fossil record? Let's talk about that for a second. Here's another evolutionist by the name of Austin Clark. He's a biologist at the he's not there now, but he was at the Smithsonian Institute, and he writes this. He says, since we have not the slightest evidence, either among the living or the fossil animals, of integrating types, in other words, species that are like halfway between one and another, we have not the least evidence of this between any of the major groups. It's a fair supposition to say there has never been any. You catch what he's saying? He said, if you look at the fossil record, you think, well, maybe some of these intermediate steps where they were part cat, part dog, halfway in between, maybe we can find fossils of them, and we can see where he says, when you look through the whole fossil record, we cannot find a single evidence of an integrated type or something that's halfway between one species and another. Here's what you do find, is that every fossil you find falls into a clearly defined species type. Sometimes they're bigger or smaller, just like we have big and small cats, but they're all clearly well-defined. You find some species that do no longer exist, that are extinct, but you don't find any half species. Right? You don't find them anywhere in the fossil record. And there's other problems with the fossil record. I'll just mention a few of them briefly. How many of you ever heard of the Cambrian explosion? So the way this works, when you look at the fossil record, you have all these layers, right? And the lowest level is what they call the Cambrian layer. Anything below that, there's basically no fossils in that layer at all. You may find a few microscopic organisms or something, but no fossils below the Cambrian layer. This is the bottom layer in the fossil strata, right? When you get to the Cambrian layer, though, what you find, immediately you find highly complex and sophisticated fossils, like you've seen like trilobites, these big creatures with tentacles and multifaceted eyes. I mean, at the lowest level of the fossil record, you have fully developed creatures at the bottom of the and all kinds of creatures. And this is why they call it the Cambrian explosion, because it went from nothing to all kinds of life suddenly appearing all at once, all fully developed. This is what you find in the fossil record. Now, this is extremely problematic for evolution, right? If you saw little small things and they're gradually getting bigger and bigger and more complex, maybe that might support the theory, but that's not what you find in the fossil record. There's many other problems. You're out here, people are always trying to find the missing link between humans and monkeys. I mean, you've heard, we find some jawbone or something. Oh, it's the missing link between. But the fact of the matter is there are missing links between every kind of species. There's missing links between cows and horses and cats and dogs. And it doesn't matter what kind of animals you're looking at. There are no interconnecting links between any of the species. This is what you find in the fossil record. And take this too. Fossils are not normally formed when an animal dies on the side of the road or something. Maybe you bury it or maybe you just shovel it off to the side of the road. That doesn't form a fossil. The way fossils are formed is when there's a huge amount of pressure and mud and water, and it presses down and it's not able to decompose, and then all the minerals from the surrounding rock goes into the bones, it's absorbed, and it turns into rock. That's how you make a fossil, okay? Something like a flood. That's how you make a fossil. And think about this. We have huge, ginormous fossil deposits. I was reading about this one in Montana. It's about 150 to 350 miles long. It is 6 miles thick. And there are about 800 trillion tons of fossils in this one fossil bed. Now, how do you think all of these animals, we're talking millions of animals, came together in one spot and they all got buried all at once? How do you think that happened? This is not something that happens normally. And yet we find these fossil beds like this all over the world. I mean, there's millions of fossils, and there's no real explanation. The best explanation, actually, is a flood. But no one can admit that as an argument, because that would require a theological explanation. You see the problem? This is what we see, but we can't postulate that because it would require supernatural explanation. Let me talk about carbon dating. You may wonder how they look at this fossil and say, oh, this fossil is 2 million years old or 3 million years old or however, 100 million years or whatever they say. You know how they date fossils. You may think they use carbon dating to date the fossil, but that is actually not the case. So carbon dating only works back to a few tens of thousands of years. It doesn't go back very far because all the carbon ratio, was it C14, C12 or whatever, the carbon ratio depletes. It's like radioactive. It decays over time, and pretty soon it's all gone. So after a few tens of thousands of years, it goes back to like a normal level, and you cannot detect any farther back in time. So they don't use that to date fossils. You're not going to believe this, but this is the honest to goodness truth. The way they date a fossil is they look at, remember the different strata in the fossil layer? You have all these different layers. They say if you're in this layer, then it has to be 400 million years old. If it's this layer, then it's 200 million years old. If it's this layer, it's 100 million. And they just date it by the fossils, by the level in the help me out. The level of sediment, that they just look at where it is and they use that to determine the age of the fossils. Now you may ask, well, how did they determine what the age of that sediment? They say it's by the fossils that are in it. So if you have a whole bunch of fossils down here and you think those fossils are 400 million years old, then you find another fossil, then they must be 400 years old as well. And it's circular reasoning. Exactly, it's circular reasoning. So this is the honest to goodness truth. This is what evolutionists are forced to rely on, this kind of logic to try and make their case. Now, there's a lot more to this. I wish I could go into, I'm not enough of an expert to go in, like potassium, argon, these kind of datings, but there's explanations for all of these kinds of things. They're not super complicated. It's not super hard. The basic evidence is problematic. The fossil record does not support evolution. Now you may think, well, what about that thing of the horse? So we got the little horse, a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it looks like a horse is evolving over time. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those displays. If you look at the different animals, there's all kinds of problems. They just line them up because it looks like a progression. But the fact of the matter is some of those species overlapped. Some of them, they went from like 19 toes or 19 vertebrae to 12 to 18 to 16. They're like going up and down. They have a number of toes. They just lose toes. They gain toes back. And you have fossils like the small ones. They just picked a small one when you have big animals in the same time. Or when you have big ones, you could have put a small one in. You could have made it look the other way. In other words, they construct the evidence to make it look like it supports evolution, but it really doesn't. So there's a lot of major problems with the fossil record. To me, it's not a problem. It actually supports evolution. Now, here's another one. Supports creation. Thank you. Here's another one. You may not have thought about this, but this is a major problem and why Darwinism, his original theory of evolution, has been completely discounted. And that is natural selection cannot introduce new features into a species. Let me explain what I mean by that. So if you have a bunch of dogs and the big ones are more likely to survive, then the big gene is going to be passed down and your baby is going to be bigger than the ones before. And so eventually those dogs might get a little bigger and bigger up to a certain point. But if you want that dog to turn into an elephant, it has to have a trunk, right? That has to get added into the DNA. And there's no mechanism in natural selection to allow for the introduction of a new feature. So if no dog has a trunk, right, that feature is not in the DNA. It's like you have a deck of cards, right? You have all the possible ears and colors and furs and all the different characteristics of a dog. And you hand the deck like 5 cards to mom and 5 cards to dad, right? And when you have a baby, you take a couple cards from mom and a couple cards from dad and you mix them together. Now you got a new card, you got a new dog. And it's going to look a little bit like mom and a little bit like dad. You understand what I'm saying? Do you get a new card in that deck ever that wasn't in the original deck? All you can do is get some from mom and some from dad, but you cannot get a new card in the deck. And so no matter how much you try and preserve all the big genes versus the small genes, you're never going to get a card that says, grow a trunk. It's not going to happen. Natural selection cannot introduce new features. Now, at the time when Darwin made this theory, he had no idea how features were passed down from one generation to the next. And it was plausible. Maybe if they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, maybe it could turn into an elephant. That's possible. But now we know that when a baby is born, it inherits genes from mom and genes from dad, and they come together, and you don't get any new genes. You just get a new shuffling of existing genes. You see why you can't have a new feature by natural selection? And so evolutionists all basically today reject Darwin's theory and says there's no way this can work. It's absolutely impossible. And so what they did is they came up with a new theory, and this is called neo-Darwinism. It's a new form of evolution. By the way, I'll just read this. This is another atheist, geneticist. He writes, recombination merely redistributes existing genetic material among different individuals. It makes no changes to it. He's saying, look, we believe in evolution, but the reality is genetics doesn't allow for change. All it does is shuffles the genes from one generation to the next. It's impossible to have a new feature. Okay? So, number one, there's no empirical evidence. Number two, the fossil record does not support it. And number three, natural selection cannot add new features to a species, which is the whole point of the theory of evolution. No, so this new mechanism that they came up with is they said, well, if natural selection can't introduce new features, then maybe mutations can. Maybe if somehow the DNA can get mutated or changed, maybe we can get a new feature that way. And so this is called neo-Darwinism. And it's not enough just to mix genes, you have to have new genes. And so there has to be some way to construct that new card for the deck that wasn't in there originally. And so they say, well, there's radiation all around us, and it shoots particles through our body, and it can knock out a chromosome or knock out a little molecule in our DNA, something like that. It can damage our DNA, and we call that a mutation. And mutations are a real thing. It does change our DNA, and those changes can be passed on to the next generation. But here's the problem with this theory. Mutations are extremely small. It's not talking about knocking out a whole gene. We're talking about knocking out like a molecule, not even a molecule, like part of a molecule, right? Tiny changes. So if you want to change a cat into a dog, we're talking about millions of big changes, not like a few tiny changes. We're talking about big changes to the whole DNA sequence to change from one species to another. And second, mutations are extremely rare. I'm thankful it's as rare as it is, or we'd all be coming down with cancer. We'd all be dying, because that's what cancer is. It's mutations. It's the DNA that's been corrupted and damaged. And see, most mutations do not help the species. It's like you don't get a new card. It's like you put a pin through a card, and now you got a hole in it. It's not working the same, but it's not a new card. It just has a hole in it. That's what a mutation does. They did an experiment on fruit flies. And they raised one generation after another. They did 1,000 generations of fruit flies, and they bombarded them with 150 times normal amount of radiation that we're exposed to in our environment. And after 1,000 generations with 150 times the radiation that we're normally exposed to, guess what you had at the end of that time period? Fruit flies. You still have fruit flies. They don't change. Some of them died, some of them, whatever. But you just don't have any. You don't have a new species. They're still fruit flies. I read this statistic that said, in order to have 5 mutations in the same nucleus, okay, so it's not that I have one cell over here that has damage, another cell over here, but if you want to have just 5 tiny changes in the same nucleus, the chance of that happening, I don't know who calculated this, you have to have a population of 100 million individuals breeding every day for 274 billion years to get that to happen one time. That's 5 tiny individual mutations. I mean, it's basically impossible. And think about the number of mutations it would take to create a brand new species. We're talking about millions of changes in the genetic code. Mutations are almost always harmful. They're almost always degenerative. Usually those species are weakened and they die out, and natural selection actually roots out the mutations rather than supports them. Here's another one. This is a biologist, evolutionist at Berkeley University, and he writes, microevolution by accumulation of micromutations leads to diversification strictly within the species. The step from one species to another requires another evolutionary method than that of the sheer accumulation of micromutations. You catch what he's saying? He said, look, you might get some minor variation. You might have someone get blue eyes, which maybe is not normal. Or maybe someone that has red hair that's not normal, right? Maybe there are some mutations that might make some minor changes. But if you want to get one species to another, it's going to take a whole lot more than these micromutations. It's just not possible. This is an evolutionist saying, I believe in evolutionists, but it's not possible. Follow? Have I lost anyone yet? No? Okay, you guys are really sharp. I'm impressed. You ready for the last one? Here's the biggest problem with evolution. Evolution cannot explain the origin of life. How did life start? If you had some species that already exist, maybe they could evolve over time. That doesn't even really hold up. But where does the first life form comes from? You might be interested to know how Darwin dealt with that. When he wrote his book, on the very last couple pages, he said, so God created the first few life forms, and then they all evolved from there. He says, I'm just not even going to attempt to answer, because he knew Louis Pasteur was doing his work over in France, and he was showing that spontaneous generation of life is just not possible. It doesn't work. Life does not come from non-life. It just does not happen. He said, okay, I'm not even going to try and explain that. But how can you have atheistic evolution without a creator God at the beginning setting up the first life forms? It doesn't work. You have to have something to get it started. I read this quote. This is by another evolutionist. This was at Harvard University, and he wrote, one has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task, that is the creation of life from non-life, to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. He says, look, we don't know how it happens. We have no theory. We can't explain it. We can't even put together a theory for how life got started. But since I'm not a Christian, I don't believe in a creator God, it must have happened somehow. That's basically what they're saying. Well, that's farther back. We're just talking about evolution right now. So in other words, they're saying, look, there's life is so complex, it's incomprehensible that it could have just accidentally come together. Even if natural selection could produce some kind of speciation or change, where did it start? So here's the problem. If you look at even the simplest life form, let's take a basic virus. Some people debate whether or not a virus is even alive, whether it's actually alive, but it has some characteristics that look like life. A virus is still incredibly complex. It's fantastic, the astounding complexity of how the virus works. The DNA in a virus is like a 1,000-volume series. Each book has 600 pages. On every page, you have 500 words. You have 1,000 books like that. That's how complicated the DNA is. Someone said it's as complicated as like New York City. And to think that would just accidentally come together, random chance. And the problem with a virus is that a virus cannot live without having a more complex life form to live off of, right? It's a parasite that has to live off something that's more complex. So if you can't even conceive of a virus coming into existence, how is an organism that hosts the virus going to come into existence? I'll give you another example. Let's take insulin. Some of you may be familiar with that chemical. It's a fairly simple protein. It has two chains of amino acids. One has 21 amino acids. The other has 30 amino acids, these two different chains. And every molecule in that chain has to be exactly right for insulin to do its work. One scientist estimated the chance of a molecule like that coming together, said it would require more than 1 million times the mass of the entire universe shaken together many times per second for billions of years to produce one molecule of insulin. I mean, talk about the level of complexity. This is just one molecule. And yet your liver literally has millions of chemicals that it processes every day. Millions of them. They all work together to create a human being, a living being. The chance of a simple cell evolving by accident is basically zero. It's basically zero. So there's no real theory today, even in the scientific community, for the origin of life. Sometimes they say, well, it didn't start on this world, it must have started somewhere else, and it just came here on a meteor or something. But that's just passing the buck. I mean, you got to have to start somewhere, right? And it's just not going to happen. So even the most basic organs, there's a book that came out a while ago by an atheist. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. He said that the body has all these amazing structures in them that require multiple parts to function, and all those parts have to work together in order for that part. So like if you have an eye, you have the retina, and you have the cornea, and you have the lens, and you have all the neural, the optic nerve, you have all these different parts in your eye, and all of them have to work together for the eye to function. So in order for an eye to evolve, and Darwin talked about this, he said, I don't know exactly how to explain this. He talked about the eye specifically. He said, but I'm not just going to evolve a lens and a cornea and a retina and an optic nerve. I'm not going to just naturally evolve all those things and then all of a sudden they come together and start working. It's a problem that they call irreducible complexity. There has to be a certain amount of complexity for the whole thing to work. It's not like you just create a little something and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You understand what I'm saying? And you find these structures all through the body. Everything is built on these amazingly complex systems. Anyway, this was an evolutionist, an atheist rather, saying evolution just doesn't make sense. And it's true. Anyway, so in Darwin's day, maybe it was plausible. They had no idea how genetics work. All they could see was just a little dot in the nucleus of the cell. But with what we know today, the fascinating complexity of human cell, any cell really, the idea that it could have evolved spontaneously is just fanciful. That's what it is, just fanciful. So in short, evolution came about as a result of a faulty definition of science, which says we're going to exclude anything that includes any kind of theological or supernatural explanation. We're just going to automatically root those out. And it's based on an intense prejudice and bias against anything that might propose a creator God. It's certainly not fair, certainly not objective. It's not testable, it's not verifiable, it's not falsifiable. By the very definition of science, it does not follow the scientific method. It's a historical science, you could argue, but it's not science. Right? It's historical, but it's not science. And it has its own problems. There's no empirical evidence. The fossil record does not support it. There's no way for natural selection to introduce new features. Mutations cannot create the complexity that we see in new features. And the origin of life itself is simply impossible when it comes to evolution. So at least, just as a simple theologian, not scientist, but just looking at the evidence, evolution doesn't make the least little bit of sense to me. And I think when I stack that against the evidence of the Bible, the evidence of changed lives, the evidence of millions of people who have sacrificed their lives for the Bible, the evidence of Bible prophecy, the inconsistency of the Bible, the way the Bible changes my life, the way it answers the most profound and important questions of life in ways that appeal to my heart. I have to choose between those two. It's the logical and common sense approach to go with the Bible because it works and it makes a difference. I love science. I think it's powerful, but the theory of evolution flunks the science test. Amen? Any questions? Make sense? All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we will let you go. Thank you again for coming out. Make sure you're on our mailing list if you're not already, so we can let you know about our next couple events. We've got some good ones coming up, and let's have a closing word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you again for the marvelous way you've created us. What we look at when we look at the human body, the human cell, the way your mind works, the way you've created this whole world, everything is so fantastic. To think it could have come about by chance just does not even make sense. And Lord, we know the history of this some, and we know why people believe this, why they're kind of locked into this. We see the problems with it. I pray that somehow you would help us to be able to shed a little light wherever we go. And that if there's any nagging doubts or questions in our minds, Lord, that you would just erase those, give us a solid foundation so our faith could be firmly in the Bible. And I thank you and I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. By the way, before you go, if you're interested, We have some little magazines out by the front desk. This is called Creation or Evolution. If you want to take one home for some further reading, please grab one on the way out. Thank you very much. God bless everyone.